Hey folks, this is Kalani. With Shadowlands right around the corner, I know absolutely everyone is trying to settle on their main, or maybe a few mains, to play through the next expansion. But with so many classes to pick from, and so many specs within those classes, how do you know what's going to be good? Well, that's our goal today, to rank the melee DPS specs from best to worst. We're going to look at potential damage values, what specs excel in which types of content, taking into account their strengths, weaknesses and what they bring to the table, and of course how fun each class is to play. So let's get started. Death Knights are the first class on our list, starting with the Frost spec. There haven't been too many changes to Frost Death Knights overall, but the real big one that got a lot of players excited is the return to two-handed Frost, or at least the option of two-handed Frost. Yes, you can run around with the biggest weapon you can find and giggle gleefully as you obliterate smashes your opponent to pieces. Death Knights are a bit more complicated when it comes to resources. They have runes and they have runic power. You'll need to spend your runes to generate runic power, and then that fuels your really big hits. Frost has access to some great AoE abilities like Remorseless Winter, Howling Blast, Frost Scythe, and who could ever forget Frostworm's Fury? You literally summon an undead dragon to breathe frost all over your enemies in a straight line. Still one of the coolest abilities in the game in my opinion, and it really solidifies a Frost Death Knights class fantasy. They absolutely nailed this one. Between the spell effects, how your abilities interact, and just what your abilities do, you know you're playing a Frost Death Knight, and it feels great. Frost is all about burst right now. They can dish out some crazy damage in both single target and AoE, but when your cooldowns run out, so does your DPS. Until your cooldowns come back again, then you can burst some more. You have a few choices about how to play as well. You can equip that massive two-hander and go to town with your obliterates, focusing everything into a simple builder-spender playstyle, or you can find your favourite one-handed weapons and pick up the Breath of Sindragosa talent. This changes your playstyle into more of a pool and burn, where you line everything up. Set off your frosty dragon's breath and do everything in your power to keep it running as long as possible by generating more and more runic power. It is a harder build to play, but the payoff can be huge. For the most part, Frost Death Knights are also very easy to pick up and play. It's not all that complicated, which makes it great for newer melee characters. Unholy Death Knight remains the more complicated spec out of the two, so if Frost is a bit too easy, maybe give Unholy a try. You still have runes and runic power, but Unholy throws another resource into the mix, Festering Wounds. Yeah, delightful. Unholy is all about infecting your enemy with these festering wounds by using certain abilities, and then using other abilities to burst them to deal extra damage. It's kinda gross, but also kinda cool. The extra resource and debuff juggling makes Unholy a bit harder to play, but you can often line up some crazy burst damage. Unholy tends to scale very well as you add more targets. So the more you can pull, the better Unholy Death Knight can do. That's going to be very important in a world where AoE DPS has taken a big hit. A lot of their gameplay also revolves around their undead pets, and summoning more ghouls through the Army of the Dead and Apocalypse spells. If you don't want to control a pet as a melee DPS spec, Unholy might not be the one for you. If your pet gets lost or you forget to summon it, that's going to be a good chunk of your damage potential that just disappears. If you can handle the extra effort that Unholy demands, you can set up some pretty incredible scenarios that will show up almost any other DPS. It's that insane. They're currently doing pretty well on single target, but they really get to shine when you AoE. Both Death Knight specs also bring some unique utility to every group. Death Grip can never be overstated. Some fights are made significantly easier thanks to one or two Death Grips being present. They also have Anti-Magic Zone for an additional magic damage reduction tool, very handy in some encounters, and they also bring a Battle Res. It's not the most ideal Battle Res because it's in melee and they have to spend their key resource to use it, but it's significantly better than no Battle Res. Death Knights are also incredibly sturdy. It's very hard to kill a Death Knight thanks to their strong defensive abilities and their excellent self-sustain. The only thing missing is a bit of mobility, so if you love the idea of a hulking monstrosity of damage that might take a while to get to the target, but when they get there, oh boy, here comes the damage. If that sounds good to you, both Death Knight specs should serve you quite well. Demon Hunter is up next, and they're in a bit of a weird spot. Even though they've had a few talents moved around, a couple talents made baseline, some Battle for Azeroth effects have been baked in, their playstyle isn't really going to change too much. So if you know what you're doing with a Demon Hunter right now, and you enjoy its playstyle, you should still have fun with it in Shadowlands. Demon Hunters have incredible burst AoE with I-Beam and Death Sweep, and they have some talent options to really double down on that AoE, like Unbound Chaos, Glaive Tempest, and Fell Barrage. If you just want to deal a bunch of damage really fast to a lot of enemies, Demon Hunters are the way to go. I know a lot of players are going to focus on the negatives. Havoc Demon Hunters have been nerfed time and time again going into the Shadowlands expansion. They had their base self-sustain reduced, their defensive abilities were nerfed or removed, you can't cheese dodge anything with Blade Dance now, and popular talents have been taken down a peg or two. Despite all of that, Demon Hunters are still very good at what they do. They're just not going to be comfortably on top like they were for most of Battle for Azeroth. They're going to end up towards the top end of the middle of the pack, and they're going to do very well in dungeons, so don't count them out just yet. Havoc Demon Hunters will also remain the most mobile melee class in the game, so if getting to your target, sticking to your target, and just generally never getting left behind is something very important to you, Demon Hunter will be a great pick as well. On top of all of that, Demon Hunter is easy to pick up and play. They might be one of the best melee DPS to go for if you haven't played melee before, because they have an easy to grasp rotation, they can still kick out some great DPS, they're useful in every type of content, and they have a great theme and feel smooth to play. What's not to like? In terms of utility, or what they bring to a group, Demon Hunters have a reliable hard crowd control, they also have an AoE stun and can talent for a single target stun, very important in dungeons. They also have the unique 5% extra magic damage debuff that they apply to anything they touch, so you will always want at least one Demon Hunter in any raid group, and Darkness is a fantastic, if a bit RNG prone, defensive for your entire group, so they definitely have some useful tools to add into the mix. Let's move on to Druid and their melee spec, Feral. Feral Druid hasn't been in a great spot for a while now, and with a lack of changes going into Shadowlands, I don't think that's going to change too much. Their damage is split between wanting to deal some upfront damage and wanting to focus more on bleeds, and it leaves them in a spot where they don't do either very well. They can deal some okay single target damage if they're allowed to get rolling. They suffer from the same problems as any damage over time class where they need some time to ramp up and get going. But they don't really scale too well in any scenario, and they don't have many great AoE options. I think they should do better in Shadowlands than they did in Battle for Azeroth, but they'll carry around the same stigma. It's going to take some real changes to get Feral Druids out in front, to really shake off that Feral Druid bad vibe that's been following them around for a while now. If they had some changes to give them a stronger focus on the bleed aspect, they could really shine. But for right now, their damage leaves a lot to be desired. I know damage isn't everything, and anything can change with a few numbers tweaks, but Ferals have been kinda left out to dry again, which I think is a massive shame. Feral Druids could be amazing. They provide a bunch of utility thanks to their many forms, and Druids in general have a lot to bring to the table. You have a battle res, crowd controls, knockbacks, mass roots. You can swap form to change things up and help out where needed in your group. The only problem is, any other Druid brings most of that stuff too, and Feral is competing in the melee spot, which is already crowded, and there are lots of melee who just do it better right now. Thankfully, as a Druid, you'll always have the most choice in the game. You can play about with Feral, swap it up with some Guardian tanking, go ranged as a Boomy, and Restoration is always a good pick too. No other class in the game can fill all three roles, including melee and ranged DPS. Feral just needs a few tweaks to catch up on the melee side of things. Another class with a bit of an oddball melee spec is Hunter. Survival Hunters have also kind of largely been ignored for the most part throughout the Shadowlands test cycle. They haven't received too many changes, so you'll be playing with the same tools as what you had going into Battle for Azeroth. If you love your melee Hunter, that could be a good thing. You still fight alongside your pet, right up in the boss's business, stabbing away with your polearm or staff. You bring the vast majority of the utility that the Hunter class brings. The only major difference is you do it from a melee point of view rather than a ranged point of view. So even though you do bring hard CC, an AoE slowing field, a strong single target stun, trank shot for enrages, and an immunity, Marksmanship and Beast Mastery do that as well, and they do it a bit better because they can maintain uptime on targets while running around. Despite that, I think Survival Hunter is actually really cool thematically. You have traps, bombs, poisons, and you kind of swap between ranged and melee, and it's this interesting mix of playstyles. I also love that you're right beside your pet instead of sending it in and watching from afar. The rotation can feel a bit clunky sometimes, and the talent options leave a lot to be desired, but Survival does have the makings of a cool spec. The dev team just need to actually do something with it. It might seem kinda silly to say, but one of the nice bonuses of playing a Survival Hunter is the option of switching between melee and ranged. You still have Beast Mastery and Marksmanship right there waiting for you if a certain type of content or a specific monster or boss is giving you significant issues as a melee. Most classes don't have that option, so it's definitely something to consider. That being said, with both range specs of the Hunter class doing better when compared to Survival, and with this expansion shaping up to be rather melee unfriendly, Survival is a bit of a hard sell. Most of the Hunter Covenant options also work better for the range specs when compared to Survival, but if you enjoy the playstyle of Survival Hunter and you don't want to play anything else, you do you. But with the lack of attention and meaningful changes, I don't think Survival will be in a good spot for the start of this expansion. Moving on, we have the Windwalker Monks. I think visually, monks are one of the coolest classes in the game. The kicks, the punches, the flips at the same time, it all looks fantastic. So from a theme and class fantasy point of view, it's a total 10 out of 10 on the monks. Sadly, they've had a few issues throughout the alpha and beta phase, mainly because they've been ignored and haven't seen any changes until recently. Changes have been promised time and time again, but we're right on the release date's doorstep and only a handful of changes have made it in for Monk, which is a shame because I think there's an incredible amount of potential here. The rotation works well, each ability has its own unique flair, and you feel like you're playing a monk the entire time. You have 2 resources to manage, energy, just like the rogues and feral druids, but then you also have a combo point style system of chi. You use energy to generate chi to spend on your main abilities like Rising Sun Kick and Fists of Fury. If you haven't played a monk at all, I would definitely recommend it, even if you don't end up maining it. I always have a lot of fun when I pick up the monk again. You have great mobility, some very unique cooldowns, and it's just a very smooth experience overall. It is just a very fun class to play. Monks also bring great utility. They have an AoE stun, a reliable crowd control, Ring of Peace can be used for all sorts of crazy strats, and the all-important 5% increased physical damage debuff, the other side of the Demon Hunter coin. So one monk in every raid is always going to be great. The spells, abilities, and toolkit that a monk have all work. They just don't deal enough damage. Thankfully, that's one of the easiest things to fix going forward, so keep your fingers crossed for some damage buffs, maybe a couple quality of life changes, and monks might see a lot of play. Rogues are up next, and oh boy are they looking good once again. I kinda can't believe rogues haven't been knocked down a few pegs at this point. They dominated the melee in BFA, and it looks like it's going to happen again in Shadowlands. I guess someone at Blizzard really likes their rogue. All 3 specs play differently, but interestingly, all 3 specs are actually doing quite well right now. Let's talk about Outlaw first. The only big difference going into Shadowlands will be Roll the Bones becoming a cooldown instead of a combo point spender. Most of the rest of the rotation will stay the same, which is a good thing in my opinion because Outlaw is an incredibly smooth and satisfying spec to play, and now you don't have to constantly re-roll until you get something worth keeping. Now when you roll, you have to make the best of what you get, which actually allows you to not focus entirely on rolls so you can hit a few damaging abilities, which is a breath of fresh air. Of course, if you get a bad roll, you'll want to throw those dice again as quickly as you can, but for the most part I like the change. Outlaw rogues excel in cleave and multi-target situations thanks to Blade Flurry, and they have a well-rounded kit that should keep any melee lover busy. The overall theme of Outlaw is pretty awesome too. You're basically a swashbuckling pirate. Swords in each hand, or I guess axes, but you know, swords are cooler, a pistol hidden somewhere up your sleeve, and it's just swing after swing, rapid fire key presses, and the animations look super cool while you spam those buttons. As I said before, it's an incredibly satisfying spec to play. The only major drawback is the heavy reliance on those dice rolling the right way. And then we have Assassination, the master of poisons and damage over time. If you'd rather play with daggers as opposed to swords and spreading damage over time bleed effects to every enemy in your path sounds like fun, give Assassination a poke. It's an incredibly reliable damage dealer. You've got great single target sustained DPS, but as you add in more and more targets, the playstyle gets faster and faster. You gain energy for every dot you have active on a poison target, so the more you spread your dots and poisons, the more energy you have to work with, so the more you can spread your dots and poisons. It's a wonderful poisoned wound focused feedback loop that makes Assassination very smooth to play. The main problem that Assassination rogues will face is ramp up time. If they can get all of their bleeds and poisons rolling, and the target will actually survive for a little bit, they'll see some great results. Even better results if they can get everything ramped up and rolling on multiple targets. They will definitely do very well on council fights in the raid, for example. But if they can't get everything applied, if monsters or mobs are just dying too quickly, Assassination won't get to shine. That is the big difference between Outlaw and Assassination. Outlaw is all about upfront direct damage, whereas Assassination is slower. It's all about damage over time. But in that sense, the specs also cover each other's weaknesses, which is another great reason to pick up Rogue in an overall sense. Assassination also tends to be a bit harder to play when compared to Outlaw, because you have several buffs and debuffs to manage. If you can't juggle everything at once, you won't see very good results. So if you want an easy Rogue spec to play, Outlaw would probably serve you better. But perhaps Subtlety is actually the rogue spec to watch out for this time around. Sub has been doing crazy amounts of damage on the beta, and they've been nerfed a few times because of it already. They're still sitting pretty up at the top. Now obviously damage isn't everything, but when you have a class who is heads and tails above the others, it's bound to cause some ripples. Subtlety Rogue is that spec right now, so if you see a lot of players re-rolling Rogue, you know why. Sub has seen quite a few changes, which isn't too surprising considering they were nerfed into the ground in Battle for Azeroth and kind of never recovered. They have a new AoE combo point spender, their rotation was streamlined a little bit, and they have a new debuff to manage. They deal an incredible amount of damage in single target, with some potential for cleave and AoE, but the Outlaw Rogues will probably take the cake for multi-target once again. Sub focuses on stealth attacks, dancing in and out of stealth to dish out some crazy damage, and just being sneaky in general. They're more cooldown based than the other two specs, relying heavily on their shadow dance windows to exploit every weakness they can find, so if big damage windows are something you like, look no further. This also tends to be the hardest rogue spec to play because of cooldown and debuff management, which is also really cool because through all three specs you have a difficulty curve for the rogue class as a whole. Subtlety Rogue could end up being the go-to raid spec for any single target encounters, but we'll have to see what the final tuning numbers look like when the expansion goes live. And of course, we can't forget about Rogue's utility now, can we? They have Evasion and Cloak of Shadows as strong defensive cooldowns, they have some self-sustain, they have great damage reduction with Feint, and they can vanish if anything gets super spicy. They also bring AoE stealth to dungeon groups, which may prove to be incredibly valuable yet again. They have an answer to almost everything, and on top of that, they have great mobility. I don't know if you could squeeze any more utility into one class, so great damage, great utility, fantastic mobility, a cool class fantasy, 3 distinct playstyles with awesome individual flavour, and they're just doing really well. What are we still doing talking about this? Let's go roll some rogues! Let's talk about the Paladin's melee spec next, Retribution. Ret Paladin has a very clear-cut theme, the Holy Crusader. Take a big two-handed weapon, the bigger the better, infused with every ounce of holy light that shines upon this world, and unleash it upon your enemies. If you like the idea of a heavy plate DPS with a greater purpose, Paladin should be right up your alley. Their rotation is fairly smooth for the most part. They're another builder-spender spec with a bit of a twist. Their main resource is Holy Power. You build it with Crusader Strike, Blade of Justice, and Judgment, and you unleash that Holy Power with your big hitters like Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm. Instead of a rotation set in stone, Retribution is more of a priority style of play, mainly because you have some procs that can reset your main generation abilities. If that happens, you have no downtime whatsoever. If you don't get any procs, things can start to feel a bit slow, but it's definitely not the slowest spec out there. They can kick out some good single target damage, and they can dish out some crazy burst AoE damage with Wake of Ashes and Divine Storms, especially if you take talents and conduits that boost your AoE. I think set up properly, a Ret Paladin will be an AoE monster. Ret Paladins also have a baseline execute, so their rotation will get a bit busier when the bosses get below 20% health. They should be able to hold their own in raids and contribute well enough in dungeons, but damage isn't even where a Paladin really excels. I don't know if you could find a better support class in the game. Just working down the list, you have Blessing of Freedom, which carried so many strats in Nyalotha. You have Blessing of Protection, which lets you completely ignore or negate certain mechanics in dungeons and raids. You have Lay on Hands to literally instantly save the life of a group member with the snap of your fingers. Blessing of Sacrifice gives you an option to help out your tanks in a pinch. You have the newly refreshed Paladin Auras to reduce incoming damage, reduce the effects of interrupts or silences on your party, and if all else fails and you're the last one standing, you get Avenging Wrath to deal more damage whenever a group member dies thanks to Retribution Aura. Who else can say they've truly avenged their fallen brethren? Nobody. We'll ignore the part where raid members die on purpose to give the Ret Paladins a boost, but they also bring some useful off-healing capabilities too. Ret Paladins have a lot going for them, so even if their damage isn't on top, they're still a very useful spec to pick up and play. Another spec that offers up some interesting support options is Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement has seen quite a few changes this time, and they're looking like a mix of their old style with Maelstrom weapons and something a little new. It's interesting to play for sure. There are lots of things to keep track of, and Enhancement is looking to be pretty good at dishing out most types of damage. There's great sustained single target, good cleave, and some good AoE damage in there as well. They also have a few powerful cooldowns to really up your burst potential, which is always nice. The crazy Stormstrike reset chains can still happen, maybe a little rarer, and it's pretty fantastic when they do, but outside of those resets, you do have some downtime in your rotation. So if you want to be pushing buttons all the time on your melee DPS, maybe pick up Demon Hunter or something. Outside of those resets, Enhancement also doesn't have a big payoff moment. The rotation doesn't really build up to a big hit. You just kind of go through the motions and hit the buttons when they come off cooldown. I was expecting Maelstrom weapon stacks to provide that kind of feeling, but when you get to 5 stacks to instant cast a spell, it's not all too impactful. You do have some flexibility in using that resource though. You can instant cast a lightning bolt for single target DPS, instant cast a chain lightning to help with cleave or AoE, or you can actually instant cast a heal, or chain heal to keep yourself alive or to help out your healers too. I don't know how often that would happen, but the choice is there and it definitely helps you in solo play anyway. Enhancement also brings a unique buff to your group in the form of Wind Fury Totem. Yeah, the Wind Fury is back, which means any melee heavy group will likely want to pick up at least one Enhancement Shaman at the very least, so your melee can benefit from the extra swings. There's also an AoE stun on the table, a reliable crowd control, a ranged interrupt, which is quite special for a melee DPS, and Earth Elemental can save the day in a pinch. All in all, Enhancement Shamans should do pretty well for themselves, even if they don't find themselves on top of the DPS meters the whole time. And last but by no means least, we come to the Warriors. Warriors have 2 specs contending for glory, Fury and Arms. Let's talk about Fury first. Pick up your 2 favourite weapons, two-handed or one-hand, doesn't matter, and go to town. Slashing, swiping, cleaving, whirlwinding, Fury Warrior is a storm of steel. They have good sustained single target damage, their cleave damage is looking great so far, and they have some very strong AoE options as well. Fury can do it all, and do it well. And then there's Execute. I still don't think anyone comes close to a Warrior's potential in the Execute range. When a boss gets below 20% health, that's when the Warriors wake up. Execute after execute after execute. It's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of damage. If you love the idea of being a plate-wearing, weapon-collecting monster of a melee DPS, Fury might just be the spec for you. Fury is also the faster-paced warrior DPS spec out of the 2, and its playstyle is very fluid and smooth. It is incredibly satisfying to play, and you don't have long periods of downtime where you're just waiting for the next drop of rage to start DPSing again, because you have a good mix of generating and spending abilities. You will always have something to press. Now, as a warrior, Warrior, you'll bring an all-important attack power buff to your group, which every other melee will be very thankful for. You have great mobility with Charge, Intervene, and Heroic Leap. You have an AoE Slow, an AoE Fear, a very useful group-wide cooldown that increases everyone's max health. That can definitely save the day in some instances, or at least make certain mechanics easier to deal with. It's not a super fantastic list of utility, but it's definitely not the worst either. And then we come to Arms Warrior, which will probably stay in Fury's shadow for the first half of the expansion. Arms Warrior relies quite heavily on gear to make a good showing, but don't you worry. When the stats get higher, when the weapon damage starts going crazy, Arms will be back with a vengeance, which will be a good thing if you enjoy Arms, and maybe a bad thing if you don't. With these two DPS specs competing against each other, chances are you'll just play whatever is doing the most DPS, which for right now is Fury. Arms does have a very different playstyle though, so if that's what you enjoy, you should still be able to kick out some decent DPS, maybe just not as good or as reliable as Fury. Arms is about slower, bigger hits. You have more time to plan and more time to rest your fingers in between key presses, but that does mean you have quite a lot of downtime as Arms, which I know some players like and some players absolutely hate, so that one is going to be personal. Arms is currently doing okay on single target. They still have some awesome burst potential, especially in AoE scenarios with Blade Storm, and Sweeping Strikes also gives you very strong 2-target cleave, which might be the only case in which Arms actually beats Fury right now, but for everything else, Fury does the exact same thing, but better, and it's more enjoyable to play in my opinion. Alrighty, that's all the melee specs covered. So if you're desperate to see these specs ranked in an orderly fashion, I think Rogue is going to be a super safe pick once again, right on top, no surprises there. Both Death Knights are next with Fury Warriors and Demon Hunters. I think they'll all do very well. A teeny bit below that, like genuinely like a tier 2.1, I would put Paladin, Enhancement Shamans, and Monks. They'll all do well for the most part and excel in certain situations, but they're not as well rounded as the higher tiers. And then in the last pick kind of situation, I would put the Arms Warriors, Feral Druids, and Survival Hunters. They're not bad per se, but they are going to struggle more than the other specs, and the other specs just bring more to the table overall. I feel bad about Feral and Survival because they have been ignored at this point. They need a lot more love going forward for them to really shine. But that's our melee DPS rankings going into the Shadowlands expansion. Remember that fun and personal preference is something that is hard to rank, so if you find something that you fall in love with, that is going to be invaluable. But what do you think of our melee ranking? Is there anything you strongly agree or even disagree with? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. If you want to explore what's left of the beta, hang out with us live, or maybe even help us get ready for Shadowlands, you can find us over at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. We stream every Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday at 12 PM PST, and watching the stream and coming to say hi is one of the best ways you can support the channel right now, and if you ever wanted to be included in the long list of names at the end of every video, a subscription on Twitch is the easiest way to make that happen. You get a free sub to any Twitch channel if you have Amazon Prime too, so be sure to take advantage of that. A big thank you to everyone who's subscribed on Twitch already, and to our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, well, now you know how. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always, I'll see you next time.